And I think we are live. Hi, everybody. Krista Miller, Executive Director of the Louisville Bar Association. Thanks for joining us for our community conversation today. We are joined by Mike Slaton. He is the Executive Director of the Louisville Pride Foundation. You may have already read an article by Mike in this month's Bar Briefs that came out at the beginning of this month. And we wanted to welcome him to talk a little bit Foundation about things that they've got coming up and other ways that our membership can help support them. So, Mike, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and the foundation, and we'll get started.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. I appreciate the opportunity. My name is Mike Slaton. I'm the Executive Director of the Louisville Pride Foundation, and we are a 501c3 not-for-profit corporation that was created in 2014. And we began doing the Louisville Pride Festival, which is in September in 2015. And so we've done that for 5 years. Unfortunately, we had to cancel the last 2 years, but we will be back with the Louisville Pride Festival on Bardstown Road, September 17th of this year. People are also often familiar with the Kentuckiana Pride Festival and Parade, which is coming up on June 18th. And that's a separate organization that we work alongside with that does that event, and we'll be out there. And we just had the Southern Indiana Pride Festival in June 4th as well. So there's a lot of pride organizations in the area, and we all try to support each other and promote each other's events. And there's a lot of other organizations as well. A lot of people are interested in advocacy and issues like that. That's usually something that we defer to the Fairness Campaign on as kind of the political leaders in our community. But the Louisville Pride Foundation, we do the Louisville Pride Festival, as I mentioned, and then we are opening an LGBTQ community center. Our grand opening is officially going to be June 23rd of this month, and that's at 1244 South 3rd Street in Old Louisville. And so that's going to be a really exciting asset for our community that we haven't had in a long time. And then we do some other events and things like that. We actually have an event coming up on Sunday. We're doing a 5K run in Cherokee Park. I think there's still a few spots left if anybody wants to sign up for that. And then we're following that up with a community picnic in at Cherokee Park as well. So that's this Sunday. And then we have a couple other programs and things, and we're going to do a lot of programming at the center once we get it open.
Great. What was kind of the genesis of the idea for the center? What kinds of services will it provide? How can folks utilize the center? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, there was a center here briefly in the 80s, and there hasn't been one since then. But in most communities larger than Louisville and a lot of communities smaller, you will have an LGBT center. And this is something that's been talked about in the community in different ways over the last several years, off and on. We took it up kind of as our goal in 2020 and in January of 2020. And, we kept with it through COVID. And so we found this great spot and have been working on getting it ready for the last few months. And it's going to be ready. It won't be finished when we open, but there'll still be continuing to be work. But the center it's going to have sort of three goals. One is to be a safe and affirming gathering place for LGBTQ people and our friends and family. Even today, that continues to be a challenge, just to have places where people can come together and relax and be themselves. A lot of times for the LGBT community, the only place that really exists that fills that niche are bars. And of course, that's not appropriate for everybody. That's not accessible for everybody. So having something that is more of a sober space, that is more family oriented, more inclusive and open to everybody is really important. And then the second part of our mission is to be a backbone organization for the community. So anybody that's doing work that supports the LGBTQ community, we want to be able to support that work. And so that can be as simple as creating a place for people to have meetings and events, which can be a real challenge, to find a place that is LGBT friendly and is public, but not too public, and sort of private, but not too private to have an event or a meeting. We'll also be providing administrative support and services for small organizations. We're going to have kind of some co-working space. So if you're a small business or an all volunteer nonprofit, we can kind of be your headquarters. And then also creating networking events and things like that so people who are doing work, we can connect them with other people doing similar work or different work that is complementary. And then the third part of our goal is to be a trusted point of entry for critical services. So most of the resources and services that people need exist in the community in some way, shape, or form already, but people have trouble accessing them. They may not know where it is, they may not know how to do it. And a lot of times for LGBTQ people, a lot of the services are available through community ministries or churches or things like that. And so they may not feel comfortable accessing that service, or they may have had some experience that just makes them less trustful. Oftentimes people in marginalized communities, it's a little bit of an additional step to be able to access help. So what we want to do is not try to reinvent the wheel, but to work with existing providers to either bring them into the center to offer those services or be a referral to help people get them. So some of the ones that are in the works, we're doing a name change clinic with Dinsmore Legal on Saturday, June 25th. So that'll probably be a quarterly event. So especially for trans or non-binary people who are interested in changing their names, they can come into a safe environment, meet with an attorney, meet with a notary. If they're ready, they can do all the paperwork right then. If they just have questions, they can find out about it. We're doing a clothing swap the following day, kind of as part of our grand opening. And then ongoing services, we're going to be working with Dare to Care to do a small food bank on site. We're going to be working with mental health providers to have therapists on site who can treat people or can talk to people for hopefully for free, and if not for free, for very low cost. And have financial coaches on site, just things like that that people may not necessarily know how to access or feel comfortable accessing. But if they come into the center for movie night or game night or a social event, then they can come back tomorrow and get their flu shot or get HIV testing or whatever it is they may need.
And tell me a little bit more about, I thought it was interesting the way that you termed that about being that kind of critical point of entry for a lot of these services. Because as you said, a lot of these services are available out in the community in separate locations or under the, separate umbrellas. But, I know it's not easy. It's not simple for someone to just walk in and access those services when they're part of the LGBTQ community. Talk about what it means to have that safe space, that place where you can bring those services together and folks feel better able to access them without, obviously there are personal safety issues, but also just even microaggressions of, people using names they don't wish to go by any longer. And sometimes those things are necessary for the legal process, as you're saying about like the name change event, but still are an attack on who you are personally. Tell me a little bit more about the critical point of bringing those together in a space for folks where they can access them in a safe way, both physically, emotionally, psychologically.
Yeah, and that's a really good example. I mean, when you're talking about a name change, it would be very difficult not to be talking about somebody's dead name in that process. For trans people, when they transition, everybody's different, but commonly it's considered very rude, very inappropriate to use somebody's old name, which is often referred to as their dead name. Obviously, for accessing legal services, if you socially transition before you legally transition, you may have a name that doesn't match your appearance and your gender identity. But that may be your government name, so to speak. So, it's one thing to have to use that, but then to be able to work with people who are going to be respectful and use your pronouns, use your name, your chosen name, as much as possible when addressing you, and then only be using the government name when it's time to fill out those forms. That's really important because when you're part of a marginalized community, when you're part of a group like the LGBT community, and especially for trans and non-binary people, life is just stressful. It's additional stress on top of everything that you're dealing with in the world. And the life is stressful enough already. So, to go in and try to do something that's going to help you, and then have the person who's supposed to be helping you either be potentially hostile or at least indifferent and just not respectful, it makes it that much more difficult. And when you deal with that over and over through your life, trying to get your hormones and the pharmacist won't use your pronouns, your workspace is not being, maybe it's meeting the letter of the law, but it's not being very inclusive. When you deal with that over and over and over, it's very common to just to stop trying, or to assume that you're going to see those barriers. And so for a lot of organizations that are maybe open to helping people, want to be serving people in an affirming way, there's just this gap. One of the partners I reached out to talk about doing work at the center is Dress for Success, which I've been familiar with them. I know about their work, but I never really knew whether or not they were open to serving trans women and non-binary people. And I called them up and asked them. They said, "Oh yeah, absolutely, we'd love to." They're totally on board, but that's not something I knew until I asked. And so you've got this kind of gap of people, you don't want to, you get enough doors slammed in your face, you stop knocking. And so we want to help kind of be that advocate for people in terms of helping these organizations be more affirming, helping close that gap, bringing them to the center. So it's a safe place that if you've been to the center, you've had a good time there, you've had events, so you feel comfortable going in there and meeting with somebody who's going to come in there, that can really make a big difference. And that constant level of stress, that impacts your health. That's part of why there are all these health disparities for the LGBTQ community. And these can be life-saving services in terms for people sometimes. So anything we can do to close that service gap and make it easier for people who need help to get that help, that's what we're here for.
And you spoke also briefly about, mental health issues in the LGBT community because, like you said, there's additional trauma, additional stress in the way you have to move through the world on a regular basis. Talk a little bit more about the things that you see, commonly in the LGBT community in regards to mental health and ways the center can help address those issues.
Well, first off, you see all the issues you see in the general community as well. Everything that will affect cisgender and heterosexual people, is going to affect LGBTQ people. On top of that, you've got a lot of anxiety. You have a lot of trauma. People will have traumatic experiences growing up, possibly with their church, possibly with their family, and so they're carrying that trauma that they don't always get to unpack. So you may be carrying that for 10 or 20 years. And that can manifest itself in all sorts of ways. For trans people, for non-binary people, you often have what's known as gender dysphoria, which is a condition where you look in the mirror and the person you're seeing is not how you feel, how you identify, and that can lead to depression, that can lead to anxiety, all sorts of issues. We see higher levels of substance abuse in the LGBTQ community. We see higher incidents of suicide or attempted suicide, higher instances of homelessness. There's all sorts of, and there's all interlinked. But it's, there are additional adversities that LGBTQ people face, plus it's harder to get help. So the two things combine to really create these disparities.
And I think specifically in fields like the legal field where there has for a long time been sort of accepted ways of being, ways of looking, ways of reacting in a professional capacity. One that I work with frequently makes jokes about, the lawyer's coloring book and everything in it is gray. We have this reputation of being kind of a monolith, but for members of the LGBTQ community that are in that also working in that legal community, what are ways that you can help recommend that folks feel they can be present without jeopardizing their contacts, their profession, for folks who may feel like they have to hide that part of themselves in a professional capacity? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think you can always lead by example. Wherever you are, if you're living with integrity and dignity, you don't always have to talk about what you're doing if you're doing it. But hopefully people do still feel pressured in different fields and different careers. It is very difficult to be out. It can certainly lead to real damaging effects on your career long term or in the short term. But I think we the biggest way we change that is by people being able to come out. The more people are out, the more other people see them, get used to them, understand that people are just LGBTQ people are just like everybody else. So I think when to the degree that people can come out, that is always the biggest thing that makes the biggest change. But you can be an ally, and I think it's important, even if you're not part of the community, to be an ally and be a visible ally, because then that helps people come out and helps them know that you're a safe person to come out to, that you're a safe person to talk to about an issue if you're not out. And so putting and I'm a bad example of this because I didn't do it for our Zoom today, but putting your pronouns into your email signature or your Zoom, or introducing yourself and saying, I'm Mike, I use he, him pronouns, that's a thing that really indicates your support for the trans community. You could have a flag in your office, you can have things like that. Just those really simple small ways that send a message. Because if somebody walks into your office and they see a trans flag on the wall or something, that's going to send a message that that's going to be a welcoming environment for them. And then you could go a step further and be involved in an organization, serve on a board, serve on a committee, and then talk about that at your work. That if you're doing, pro bono legal work for an LGBT group, that not only is helpful for that group, that's sending a message to everybody in your workplace. I think you don't have to, you can help create that culture that homophobia and transphobia is not going to be accepted in your office. And I think that's something people can do, whether they're part of the community and whether or not they're out. You can help create that culture.
Well, and that's such great advice too for managers, for hiring personnel, for supervisors, to be mindful of that. And also, we shouldn't just be on the LGBTQ person to make their environment feel welcoming and safe for them. It's on all of us to make those environments safe and welcoming. So that's great advice too, if you're someone who may not be sure how to welcome an employee or welcome a colleague that is identified as LGBTQ, ways that you can set aside that space for them and not force them to do it for themselves. And that kind of leads me, I guess, into, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but our last question that I always like to ask is, how can the LBA, how can our membership be supportive of your organization, your mission, your community? What are some things that we can do?
Yeah, and I wrote about some of this in that bar brief that I think is out there now. So one is to be, of course, for LGBT nonprofits like our organization, we need legal counsel. We need people who can help us. And often we are more likely to be targeted. It's because of the work we do, we have more enemies than an animal shelter might. Our website was recently getting some kind of cyber attack, and it started on June 1st. It's not a coincidence that our website for an LGBT group is coming under attack on the 1st of June. So I don't know that that's not something an attorney could probably help with, but we can get targeted. And of course, and you all know, a stern letter from an attorney can be very intimidating if you don't have that experience. So having people that we can call on is important. Trans people are dealing with legal transition. So having people who can help them with name changes, changing their gender marker on their passport, their birth certificate, these can be very confusing processes for people. They vary from county to county, and they can be expensive. They can really, and for people who don't have a lot of money, even a very small fee to get your birth certificate reissued can add up. So help with that. Family law, adoption, surrogacy, these are always issues that are important for the LGBTQ community. So being educated on those sort of things, being able to help people. But then really, I think probably the main thing that everybody can do, regardless of what you're doing, is to be an ally, be aware of these things, send that message that you're somebody that's going to be affirming, so that if I'm starting a business or if I'm doing, whatever the law piece that I'm working on is, that my attorney is going to be able to be an advocate for me and not one more person that I have to educate, one more person that I have to watch how I say things around, or that's going to be kind of one more stressor in my life. If you can really, look around, follow. There's a lot of people on Instagram and TikTok who have some really great accounts where they'll share their experience of being trans or being LGBT, including some attorneys. And I should try to look those up to share. But just kind of, be aware, educate yourself so that you can be a better advocate for your clients.
And obviously, as you said, you're a foundation, you accept donations, and I'm sure you guys will be participating in Give for Good coming up this fall as well. That's all gearing up right now. So that's another way folks can support. Mike, I just really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for sharing so much information with us this month and our bar briefs and with us today. Hope that the kickoff for the community center goes well, that the name change clinic goes well with our friends over at Dinsmore. And, we'll definitely be looking for you out on Bardstown Road this September.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, we can always use money too. Yeah, that is definitely, if anybody wants to be a sponsor or of our event or any others, we will always welcome that. So yeah, but thank you very much, Kristen, for inviting me to talk, and thank you for the work that y'all do.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Mike, for joining us. And for all of our members, if you've got any questions, feel free to give us a call or email us, and we will see you for our next community conversation soon. Thanks.